One of my favorite things to do is to listen in on my kids as they play. They create magical worlds of make-believe, all while sitting in their playroom or running around in our backyard. I hear them say things like, "Pretend we're in outer space," or "This time I'm going to be the dragon." And as I listen, the moments warm my mama heart for innumerable reasons. They're getting along, they're having fun, and they're reminding me just how powerful the gift of imagination can be. I pray they carry that gift with them forever, because imagination continues to be crucial throughout our lives. In fact, it's sometimes said that imagination is a key component of something else that's very important: hope. Because when we hope for the good we can imagine. Today we're talking all about the concept of hope. What is hope? And why does our guest today note it as more than a careless wish, but rather something that is fundamental to our health? From the H.E. Butt Foundation, this is the Echoes podcast. On today's episode, we welcome our guest, Dr. Lydia Dugdale. Lydia is a professor of medicine and the director of the Center for Clinical Medical Ethics at Columbia University. She also studied at Yale Divinity School. A practicing medical doctor, Dugdale studies hope and end-of-life issues. She's the author of The Lost Art of Dying and has a forthcoming book on the theme of hope. She's also recently led a Lady Lodge retreat all about how to hope well. We're thrilled to have her here today. I'm here with my co-host, Marcus Goodyear. Welcome, Lydia.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're glad you're here.
Lydia, there's so much here. I think most folks listening will immediately understand how relatable the concept of hope is, but also how complex this concept of hope is. And I think the place to start would just be, what is hope? Can you help us with a definition for hope?
So hope is actually a rather complicated topic once you start to unpack it. And I spent about a year reading different philosophies of hope and theologies of hope to try to arrive at an explanation or a definition of hope that I thought did the most work for the broadest audience in the best way possible. So let me start with that preamble. So the definition of hope that I arrived at draws heavily from Thomas Aquinas, but is not exclusively Aquinas's account of hope. It sort of blends some other ideas. But here's how I define it. Hope is the habit of orienting and reorienting toward a future good that is not exactly clear at the present moment, that is difficult to achieve yet possible to achieve. So it has all of these elements. It's future, it's good, it's possible, right? We don't long for or orient toward goods that are completely impossible, right? So it has to be within the realm of possibility. But it's also not something that's just handed to you, right? We don't orient towards future goods that are right in front of us, right? So there's a certain amount of struggle in working toward hope. And I like this idea of hope as a habit, or the ancients would use the word virtue. This suggests that this isn't something just given to us. Actually, we're talking about the kind of hope you have to work at. And the really great thing about this sort of idea of hope as a habit that one works at is that it gives us some agency in the process. Not only we ourselves, but also our communities.
What does it look like to work at hope?
Yeah. So the ancients would say virtue is synonymous with a habit, which is synonymous with an excellence. These are things that one practices again and again and again. So, for example, Aristotle in the ancient world would say to have the virtue of courage, you have to be thoroughly courageous inside and out. And what does this mean? This means that you practice courage. If you want to be courageous, you do courageous acts. And in the process of doing courageous acts, one's character is transformed into one who is courageous.
Lydia, it sounds kind of like exercise, like we're needing to create these habits and kind of a regimen of exercise that kind of strengthens our hope muscles. Is that way off or is that
That's it. That's it
okay?
exactly. Yeah.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how hope is a communal work. What does that mean?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think as a Christian, I can't help but think about hope as what one poet calls the middle sister between the two older sisters of faith and love. Okay.
Yes.
And so on that accounting, what is the relationship between faith, hope, and love? Hope is in the middle. And I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to do so by way of faith, then
That's
hope,
great.
then love.
That's great.
So in the Greek, the word for faith is pistis, which actually in the ancient world was used synonymously with the evidence that would be presented in court. So you
Mm,
knew that you would win a court case because you had faith. You had the pistis, the evidence that
Mm.
would support the claim you were making.
okay.
So if hope is the middle term between faith and love, then faith is looking backward and saying, I know that a future good will come, even though I can't see it right now, because I have evidence, I have proof in my life that even when all hope seemed to be lost, actually good did come. And
Wow.
so
Mm.
faith is a way of looking backward to give us the foundation, the stability to know that we can hope going forward. Okay, so that's the relationship between faith and hope. Love, then, it's a two-way street. So when we become people of hope, we can then be agents of hope or surrogates who hope on behalf of the hopeless around us, on behalf of the
Mm.
despairing in our communities. But when we ourselves are incapable of feeling hope, of practicing hope, of exercising hope, then those of us embedded in communities can draw on the hope that has been cultivated by our communities, by the people in our communities, to hope on our behalves. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It's beautiful, really, that there's this leaning on of each other in community in this context of hope. That's really gorgeous. Thank you.
I don't know if I should say this or not, but I'm in Kerrville, and we're dealing with community trauma here. There were some floods this summer, and it was rough. So I am thinking right now of some of the communities I'm in right now. If I were to turn to those communities for hope, they might not have much resources for me. And I think that that's probably something people encounter where they're in a community that provides hope for them for a time, and then something in that community breaks or becomes dark, and it ceases to be a hopeful support for them. So how do we remain beacons of hope for our communities when maybe our communities don't have that hope themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know I was down at Lady Lodge just the week after the flooding in Kerrville, and to be there was such an honor at that time, but also so hard. And it
Mm.
really brought into relief the need to think clearly about hope. What I'll say is that there is a real give and take in all human relationships where circumstances change, trauma presents itself, mental illness strikes, physical illness strikes.
Mhm.
You know, I'm a physician. That's what I know really well. And the person who may have been the one who had best cultivated a habit of hope may in a season not be that person who can hope well or hope on behalf of others. We can't just rely on one person to be, oh, she's the one who hopes for our congregation, right? Um, but one body, many gifts. But we also, I believe, all need to be working at this process of cultivating the gifts that we might not naturally possess, right?
Mm,
So again, going back to the ancient world, you know, there's some debate in the ancient world about whether the truly virtuous person needed to possess all virtues. And some thinkers thought you did. And so you might not be naturally disposed at all toward hope or toward courage or toward patience. but that doesn't mean you don't work at them. We can look around and see what sorts of traits we're called upon to inhabit, to
Mm.
adopt, to cultivate. And if we aren't those kinds of people, then we do need to be working at that and not just rely on someone else who might be so inclined or so disposed.
Lydia, you mentioned just a bit there about this concept of hope in a context that is, of course, quite salient for you, which is in the health context or in the context of medicine. Can you talk a bit more about how you see hope come into play in your practice of medicine?
Yeah, so I have two earlier books, both on preparing patients for death. And
Hmm.
in the process of doing hundreds of book talks, especially on the latter book, a theme that came up again and again is okay, so you keep saying we're all going to die. We know we're all going to die. But then what is hope? And it's interesting because St. Augustine talks about hope as being the middle term or the golden mean or the average between two extremes. On the one hand, you have despair, which is etymologically, so the word itself means lack of hope. That's what despair
Mm,
means.
yeah.
So,
Hmm.
another way to put this is a deficiency of hope gives you
Mm.
despair. But on the other extreme, there's the excess of hope. And what is the excess of hope? Well, Augustine would say excess of hope is presumption, but I think a better way to characterize it is false hope. And so I see this in the clinical setting all the time. I have patients who get the terrible diagnosis or who are told that their prognosis is terminal, that there's nothing else that can be done. And those patients often are prone to hopelessness, to fall into
Mm,
despair, the deficiency of hope. But
Hmm.
then there are other patients who reject that and say, no, 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 I don't believe you. I know that there will be a cure. I know that I'm going to leave the hospital alive. And that I would say is an excess of hope, a presumption or a false hope. And so that's the way I see both. I would say probably, um, well, it depends. It depends. I think more despair in the community, and maybe it's half and half in the hospital, half despair and half
mm,
false hope. I think physicians, medical doctors themselves probably prefer false hope because it keeps us from having to be honest with patients and have those really hard conversations. So if we can sort
Hmm.
of fuel or feed their illusions of false hope, then we don't have to do the really difficult work of helping them prepare and grieve and walk toward their certain end.
Wow. What
yeah.
a job you
Mm,
have.
yes. I can imagine. I'm just thinking back on my own experiences, and I can imagine you kind of see both sides of that, where some physicians might want people to be really hopeful and some, maybe giving information that feels like it leads to people, being more likely to be despairing. I remember my grandmother, she had cancer, CLL, later in life, and she went many, many years and didn't have really any symptoms. So they detected it early, and so but then as the years started to go by, it was becoming harder and harder for her, and so she would have stints in the hospital. And I
Mhm.
remember one time in particular, she went into the hospital and they ended up saying, "Okay, it's time for you to go to rehab now." And I remember my mother was so upset one day and I said, "What happened?" And she said, "This doctor came in and basically said like count the days. This is it's pretty much over here. The goodbye is coming soon." And she said he was so negative and I didn't understand where that was coming from. And I remember in that particular instance, my grandmother got out of the rehab and lived for several years after that. And so my mom really felt kind of vindicated in that. Like, you see, he had no business talking like that to me. But then I can also imagine his perspective, maybe thinking of how many times it didn't go that way.
Yes, well, I'm thankful for your family that your grandmother had some more years.
Yes, yes.
But yeah, it's so tricky. We know from the data that doctors are horrible prognosticators, and at the same time, I do think, I do think good doctors want to try to help their patients prepare.
Yeah.
I think bad doctors often run away from the difficult conversations, or they might be technically competent, but I think good doctors are walking step in step with their patients. And then you have, it's often the young doctors who want to be brutally honest because they think that's what they're supposed to do, but haven't quite learned the maybe finer art of relaying this information gracefully.
A little
Um,
finesse.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very tricky, and because we're poor prognosticators, and because the unexpected does happen. I mean, miracles do happen.
Yeah.
So Camille was talking about her grandmother. My father-in-law died during COVID, not
Mm.
of COVID, but it was very fast. The prognostication was accurate, unfortunately, but it was still sort of beautiful because he knew what was going to happen and somehow was hopeful. So I learned from him a tremendous
Mm.
amount during that process. And we're a couple years away, but I am starting to see people grieve differently than I had an opportunity to. You have mentioned this, it's a little far out, but this idea that people are using AI to grieve differently.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that and what you think of that as what advantages does it bring and are there some downsides?
So, AI is kind of changing a lot of things. Um,
Yeah.
but one tool that has become available is to, for example, take any audio or video that a loved one has ever made and feed it into an AI that can then generate an avatar of your loved
Mm.
one where you can have conversations with your loved one, as if he or she was really there in the computer, right, having a conversation with you, but
This is like a
it's just
video avatar.
yeah, it's like a video avatar. We already have we're using this sort of technology in many different ways, but this is yet another way that it's being used. It, in a sense, it doesn't memorialize your loved one. It immemorializes your
Mm.
loved one, right? Because this is now someone who isn't dead. Here you are, you're having, I mean, they're dead, but you're here having a conversation just as we're having a conversation now, looking at them through the screen. They're saying everything that they would say as if you were actually talking to them when they were alive, using the same voice, making the same mannerisms, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, look, I don't know data on this, but my sense is that maybe this helps people grieve well. I don't think we know yet, really. I think it's too early to say. We do know that it's very normal for up to about a year after someone dies to hallucinate that you're hearing them, to dream
Mm.
about them, to
Right.
think, oh, wait, mom, oh no, mom's not here, right? That's sort of a phenomenon where yeah, it's as though they're there. They're such a part of your consciousness that you feel like you're always about to reach out to them, or they're always saying something to you. That's normal. That is a normal part of the grieving process. And usually what patients describe to me is that experience of, if we want to call it hallucinations, I don't think that's actually quite the right word, but that what feels almost like a hallucination. I thought I heard my loved one's voice. That
Mhm.
tends to fade with time. Now, I don't know how that will change if you have the avatar sitting in your laptop talking to you every night over dinner. I think it's too early to say totally if this is going to mess up the natural grieving process, but it certainly will disrupt it,
Yeah.
disrupt natural grieving. But whether it's harmful is too early to say.
Wow. But my first reaction to just even the thought of that is, gosh, that feels strange. And I think it's mostly because of what you're saying, that it's not what's meant to be happening. Right?
Mhm.
Like that's
Yeah.
not the natural course of things. And I wonder if there will be, I imagine there would be some physiological consequences. Almost like, couldn't you develop a dependency on, I'm just thinking of the downsides, like, that could begin to feel like a hit from a drug, you know?
Oh
And
yeah.
Hmm.
I think, gosh, that I imagine the dangers and the downsides. Are there pros that you can imagine in that context?
I think it does sort of ease the pain, right?
Sure.
I mean, in the same way, I think now of, I don't know, maybe it's just movies of, the glory days
Hmm.
on the battlefield where the guy takes out the photograph of his wife and, kisses her. Well, right. Is there a way
Yeah.
in which that avatar is, in a sense, helping to soften the grief of separation and death? Just
Mm.
like that photograph in your pocket on the battlefield might have done that. Perhaps.
Yeah, it makes me think of the uncanny valley. This idea that the closer something gets to being human, I first learned about it with robotics. That the closer a robot is to almost human, the more likely it is to feel like a zombie or like a corpse. And so when
Mm.
I have sorry, this is a little dark. When I have a photo on the battlefield, like there's no mistaking the photo for my
Yeah.
loved one. I understand it as a representation, but when I have a real time, realistic animation of my somebody who was close to me, who is now dead, in my computer in a way that I have seen them there before when they were alive. It feels like we're crossing into some kind of uncanny valley, although maybe it's not even uncanny, it's just confusing. I don't know. If to me it feels somehow dishonest in a way that is new. But maybe I'm
Yeah.
just
Mm.
being cranky
No,
about new technology.
I think you're right. So, a colleague of mine, yeah, I've just been at an AI conference. A colleague of mine was talking about how in traditional religious iconography, there's often a flaw that's introduced into the icon, as if to tell the viewer, this is not reality. You can see there's a flaw. This is not the person himself. This is just an icon. This is just an image.
Yeah.
And one of the tensions with the AI programmers who are developing this technology is that they don't want to have to introduce flaws into their avatars because the flaws suggest imperfection in their work.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
yet then it is inauthentic. It's deceptive, right? If I
Hmm.
think I'm actually talking to Marcus Goodyear, but in fact, I'm just talking to some sort of generated avatar of Marcus Goodyear, that's who are you really? With whom am I really speaking? Is this even a conversation? This isn't two human beings, right? It starts to just really spin out of control. But there's a tension because the technology designers do not want to introduce flaws for the sake of ensuring that this is simply technology and not reality. So there's a reticence to make the distinction between reality and fiction clear.
It feels like we've drifted away from hope, although I'm very curious to hear you talk about just the ways in which people are placing very strange hope in AI. Have you experienced that as well, or am I?
Well, so if we want to take this back to my work on hope, I will say this, that I think it's very important to distinguish between hope in an object or a person
Uh-huh.
and hope as a fundamental orientation toward a future good. One is a posture and the latter is a posture, this orientation toward a future good. It's a disposition, it's a habit.
Hmm.
Whereas when I say I'm hoping in something, it's putting all of the weight, all of the work into the object of my hope. And that object has to then be able to do that work. And as Christians, we would say no object can do that work, right?
Yeah.
Only God can do that work. And
Yeah.
that's why it's very common for Christians to say, well, I hope in God. My hope is God. My hope is
Yes.
Jesus, right?
Yes.
There's a way in which we could say of AI, if my hope is in AI cannot do the work of bearing all of our existential, all of our eternal, ultimate questions. AI cannot hold those. AI can do some really cool stuff. It's a great tool. It's a great research assistant. it's great at confusing us and sending us down rabbit holes, right? I mean,
Yes, yes.
AI can do some really, really phenomenal things, but AI is not God and will never be God.
I mean, I feel like you've queued us up here. We have an audio clip from 1982. This is Howard Butt Jr. Again, he's a voice we hear from time to time because we are the H.E. Butt Foundation, sponsored by the H.E. Butt Foundation, and that means Howard Butt, H.E. Butt. So he used to speak at Laity Lodge. He helped start Laity Lodge, and here he is talking about hope in a very similar way from 1982.
Apart from hope, what happens is we fall off one side of the horse or the other. We fall into despair, or we go to the other extreme and fall into presumption. This is the manic side, we're too high. Or this is the depressive side, we are too low. The problem of life is to avoid the extreme of presumption or despair. And that's what hope offers us, because hope does not fall off the horse on either side. Hope sits steady in the saddle. Hope has it all together. It is neither too up or too down.
We've heard a lot of that sentiment from you, Lydia. What are your reactions to that clip?
Yeah, I love that. I think he totally hits the nail on the head. I had never thought of despair as well. I had thought of despair as a kind of depression, sure, but to think of false hope or presumption as mania was definitely a novel thought for me. But Howard, captures it really beautifully. What Augustine said, which is that hope is the mean, it's the middle, it's sitting on the horse between the extremes of despair and presumption or false hope. And how do you sort of stay on the saddle? I mean, the beautiful thing is that I think there's for all of us, there's a little bit of jostling in the saddle, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
we are leaning a little bit towards the despair. Sometimes we are leaning a little bit too much toward expecting it to go the way we think it should go, and it better go that way. And so it's okay that we're not sitting perfectly on the saddle as we should be. But if we're just sort of, sliding away from hope in one direction or the other and we can course correct, then we get back on the saddle.
Lydia, we heard, even from some of the AI stuff that we were discussing, but just in general, that obviously, especially in the medical context, some of this can get a little bit dark. There can be times when it's, some of this is kind of sad to talk about. I'm curious, just kind of on a personal level, what it's like to study death and dying. Does that take a personal toll?
Um, no, not really.
That's good. That's great.
Okay.
That's good
Uh,
news.
yeah. So here's the thing on well, there's several things. I do think people who think about these questions sort of routinely are probably more comfortable just based on personality type, disposition, upbringing, all of those things. So I grew up in a household where my grandfather had been a bomber pilot. He had a plane crash during flight school. He was shot down during World War II. He was taken prisoner of war. He was in one of the worst prison camps in Europe
Mm.
before finally being released, had lifelong medical problems because of what happened to him in prison camp. Anyway, but he was also a very hilarious man, and he was always joking about being on good terms with the undertaker, and he's going to have coffee with the undertaker, and if any of the grandkids got a tattoo, he was going to write the grandkids out of the will, and so everything was this constant conversation about sort of the exuberance of life mixed with the reality of death. And he was
Mm.
making jokes about it all the time. So I grew up in that context and I thought that was normal. And then I got into medical training and realized, oh, wow, so many of my colleagues don't even want to talk about death.
Oh.
I had a colleague say, Oh, I don't know why you think about death. I do everything I can to avoid talking to my patients about death because I myself am
Huh.
so afraid of death. I've read physician writers who describe their drive to study medicine was motivated in large part because of their own death anxiety. They needed
Mm,
to study the body to be able to master the body because they themselves are so afraid to die. So,
Hmm.
my upbringing then isn't the norm for people in medicine, I came to realize. But the flip side is that because I was comfortable thinking and talking about death, and because death is the great equalizer, right? Every single one of my patients will die.
yeah.
Every single one of us will die.
Yeah.
It made sense to try to help prepare my patients because it turns out that so many of them were coming into the hospital woefully unprepared
Yeah.
with
Hmm.
relationships they wished they had mended, but now they're
Mm,
sick and dying and it's too late. With religious questions they had avoided their whole lives, but now they're sick and dying and it's too late.
yeah.
And now I'm assigned as their doctor in this very unfortunate setting. And they're often not with it enough to even be able to do the work of preparing for death. And so I thought, well, let me start alerting people to the
Yeah.
fact that if you want to die well, you have to live well. And those two go hand in hand. So for me, the work of preparing patients to die well is actually a very hopeful kind of work because it means they live such better lives.
So good. I think that's kind of the way to frame it in this really positive way that I think is really helpful. So thank you for that. We've heard you speak a little bit about how imagination plays into hope, and I would love to hear more about that.
Camille, I know you have thought about kids playing imaginatively.
Yes.
But actually, most children, when they make believe play, they make believe things that they have seen their parents do.
Yeah.
So you play house, you play school, you play doctor, you play, railroad trains.
Hmm.
You're iterating on things for which you have knowledge.
Yeah.
It's very rare for a child to make believe about something that they've never been exposed to, of which they have zero knowledge. So some psychologists say you can't imagine if you don't have knowledge. So if you really want to expand your imagination, you need to gain more knowledge.
Mm,
I think this is mostly true, but then we have these prophetic, mystical, poetic experiences in our tradition that suggest that sometimes there can be inspiration given that is otherworldly, from the divine,
yeah.
cosmic, whatever. And then we have to make space for saying, well, sometimes imagination can be stretched not by your own acquisition of knowledge, but by something being sort of imposed on you from without.
Yeah.
So that's why I want to make space for that. But
Yeah.
generally, the thinking is, yeah, and this is even what Albert Einstein said, that you need to expand your knowledge base in order to expand your imagination.
Mm, really, really good.
Does that also expand our hope?
So, right. So, if hope is the orientation toward that future good that is ill defined, right? We're not exactly sure what it is. We know that we need some future good, right? Whatever our circumstances are now, the world is collapsing. I don't know. I don't know. The country is becoming more divided, whatever you want to name. A loved one is diagnosed with disease X, whatever it is that makes
Yeah.
it feel like our world, my world is collapsing, and I need to orient toward that future good that is difficult yet possible to achieve, that is ill defined. Well, imagination then helps us begin the work of in a sense testing, right? Could it be this? Is this the good that will come? Could it be this good? Could it be that good? And it expands our capacity for hope. Well, with an expanded imagination, maybe you can see 10 or 15 different futures, not exactly sure how it's going to be realized, but that gives you substance for leaning in toward this future good rather than having no future.
Lydia, all of this is so good. I wonder If as we wrap up, there's just kind of a word of encouragement. I know you've spoken about hope as the long game and you've just talked
Mm.
about endurance. What do you say to folks who say, I'm trying my best to hope, but I'm pretty tired. Whatever my situation is, I'm pretty tired. Give a word of encouragement for them.
Hope is the long game. Life is a race, but we also don't run alone.
Mm,
And
Mm.
that's the piece, right? We are on a team and we need one another. We need the church. We need the Lord. And so, yes, running the long race is so hard. And you will have uphill moments and you will have downhill moments. And you will have moments when that, cramp in your side or in your calf muscles is just too much to keep going,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
And that's when somebody comes alongside and says, keep going.
Mm,
I'm with you, right? And even when there's not a human being saying that, that's the beauty of the Holy Spirit.
yeah.
I won't leave you or forsake you, right? I'm here running alongside you.
Beautiful. Lydia, we're so grateful for your time. Thank you so much for everything
Yes.
you've shared. We
Thank
appreciate
you.
you. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having me.
The Echoes podcast is written and produced by Marcus Goodyear, Rob Stinnett, and me, Camille Hall Ortega. It's edited by Rob Stinnett and Kim Stone. Our executive producers are Patton Dodd and David Rogers. Special thanks to our guest today, Dr. Lydia Dugdale. We recently featured Lydia in Echoes Magazine, and you can read the article online at echoesmagazine.org. While you're there, consider subscribing. You'll receive a beautiful print magazine each quarter, and it's free. You can find a link in our show notes. The Echoes podcast and Echoes magazine are both productions brought to you by the H.E. Butt Foundation. You can learn more about our vision and mission at hebftn.org.